Sarah Martinez never imagined that her morning jog through the downtown warehouse district would turn into a fight for survival. The 28-year-old nurse had been running the same route for 3 years, every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. sharp. The abandoned industrial area provided perfect solitude for her pre-work exercise routine, with wide, empty streets and no traffic to dodge. But this particular Thursday morning felt different. As she rounded the corner near the old textile factory, she noticed unusual activity. Black SUVs were parked in strategic positions and men in dark clothing moved with military precision between the buildings. Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in immediately. Something was very wrong here. She slowed her pace, trying to appear casual while observing the scene. These weren't construction workers or security guards. The way they communicated through earpieces and checked their weapons suggested something far more dangerous. Sarah realized she had stumbled into what looked like a coordinated law enforcement operation, but the men wore no badges or uniforms that identified them as police. Her heart rate spiked as she noticed one of the men pointing in her direction. She had been spotted. The logical thing would be to turn around and run back the way she came. But as she glanced over her shoulder, she saw more vehicles blocking that route too. The warehouse district that had always felt safe and empty had become a trap. The man who had spotted her began walking toward her, speaking rapidly into his radio. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to explain that she was just jogging, but something about the intensity of the operation suggested these people wouldn't care about innocent bystanders. The buildings around her formed a maze of loading docks, fire escapes, and narrow alleys that she had never paid attention to before. Making a split-second decision, Sarah veered off the main street and sprinted toward the nearest building. Behind her, she heard shouting and the sound of boots on pavement. Multiple voices were now coordinating her pursuit, and she realized with growing terror that she had accidentally entered what military personnel would call a kill zone, an area where anyone present would be considered a threat to be eliminated. The old warehouse loomed ahead of her, its broken windows and rusted fire escape offering the only hope of escape. Sarah had always been athletic, but she had never run for her life before. Every muscle in her body screamed as she pushed herself harder than ever before, knowing that slowing down might mean she would never see her family again. As bullets began to shatter the concrete around her feet, Sarah understood that whatever operation was taking place here, witnesses were not meant to survive. She was no longer just an accidental observer. She had become a target in someone else's deadly game, and her only chance was to disappear into the maze of abandoned buildings before the net closed around her completely. The warehouse door stood, slightly open, darkness beckoning beyond the threshold. Sarah could hear vehicles converging on her position from multiple directions. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they would surround the building entirely. Taking a deep breath, she plunged through the doorway into the unknown shadows within, praying that the building would offer more escape routes than traps. Her footsteps echoed in the vast empty space as she ran deeper into the warehouse, searching desperately for another exit while the sounds of her pursuers grew closer behind her. The kill zone had claimed many lives before, but Sarah Martinez was determined not to become another statistic in whatever deadly operation was unfolding in the warehouse district that morning. Inside the warehouse, Sarah's eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light filtering through broken skylights. The massive space was filled with abandoned machinery and storage containers that created a labyrinth of hiding spots and potential dead ends. She could hear her pursuers entering the building behind her, their heavy footsteps and radio chatter echoing off the concrete walls. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah weaved between the rusted equipment, trying to put distance between herself and the entrance. Her nursing training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this was beyond anything she had experienced in the emergency room. She pressed herself against a large shipping container, controlling her breathing while trying to listen for movement patterns around her. The men searching for her were clearly professionals. They moved systematically, checking each hiding spot with practiced efficiency. Sarah counted at least 4 different voices coordinating the search, and she realized they were slowly boxing her in. The warehouse that had seemed like salvation was becoming another trap. Through a gap between containers, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. One of the searchers carried military-grade equipment that she recognized from news reports about overseas conflicts. These weren't ordinary criminals or even regular law enforcement. The scale and sophistication of their operation suggested government involvement at the highest levels. Sarah's mind flashed to stories she had heard from veteran patients about covert operations that officially never happened. Whatever was taking place in this warehouse district was clearly something that required complete secrecy. No witnesses could be allowed to live, regardless of their innocence or intentions. A radio crackled nearby, and she heard a voice report that the target building was secure and the package was ready for transport. Sarah realized that her accidental intrusion had potentially compromised a major operation involving millions of dollars or sensitive intelligence. Her presence here wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic for their mission. She spotted a service ladder leading to a catwalk high above the warehouse floor. If she could reach it without being detected, she might be able to move across the building without being tracked. The climb would be dangerous and noisy, but staying on ground level meant certain capture. Taking advantage of a moment when the nearest searcher moved behind a container, Sarah sprinted to the ladder and began climbing as quietly as possible. Her hands were slick with sweat and adrenaline, making each rung a challenge. Halfway up, she heard a shout from below. Someone had spotted her. Bullets began pinging off the metal ladder as Sarah scrambled up the final rungs and rolled onto the narrow catwalk. The elevated position gave her a bird's-eye view of the warehouse floor, and what she saw made her stomach drop. At least 8 armed men were now converging on her position, and more were entering through doors she hadn't even noticed. The catwalk extended across the warehouse toward what appeared to be an old office area built into the wall near the far end of the building. If those offices had windows or another exit, she might still have a chance. But first she had to cross 30 yards of open catwalk while bullets flew around her. Sarah began moving along the narrow metal walkway, staying as low as possible while maintaining her balance. Below her, the searchers were repositioning to get better angles for their shots. She could see muzzle flashes in the shadows as they fired at her moving silhouette against the skylights. The office area ahead looked abandoned, but structurally intact. Sarah prayed it would contain either a stairway down to a different part of the building or a window that opened onto a fire escape she could use to reach the roof. Her pursuers were coordinating to cut off all her escape routes, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. As she reached the office doorway, Sarah heard helicopters approaching in the distance. The operation was escalating, and more resources were being deployed to ensure that no evidence of the day's activities would survive. She was no longer just running from the men in the warehouse. She was running from an entire system designed to eliminate problems like her completely. The abandoned office turned out to be Sarah's salvation, and her nightmare rolled into one. The room contained old filing cabinets and a desk covered in dust, but more importantly, it had a window that opened onto a fire escape. However, as she peered through the grimy glass, she saw that the fire escape was in full view of the men positioned outside the building. Below in the warehouse, her pursuers had regrouped and were planning their next move. She could hear them discussing bringing in thermal imaging equipment to track her heat signature through the walls. Time was running out, and conventional hiding was no longer an option. Sarah noticed something the searchers had missed in their focus on tracking her movement. The office had a second door that led to what appeared to be a maintenance shaft. The narrow passage was barely wide enough for one person, but it seemed to run along the exterior wall of the building. If she could navigate it without making noise, she might be able to reach a different section of the warehouse complex. The shaft was dark, cramped, and filled with pipes and electrical conduits that had been abandoned for years. Sarah squeezed through the narrow space, fighting off claustrophobia and the urge to panic as she heard the searchers entering the office she had just left. They were shouting orders and checking every possible hiding spot. 20 feet into the shaft, Sarah discovered that it connected to the adjacent building through a gap in the shared wall. The hole was barely large enough for her to squeeze through, but it represented escape from the immediate danger. As she emerged into the second building, she found herself in what had once been a manufacturing facility. This building was different from the warehouse. It had multiple levels connected by stairs and catwalks, creating a 3-dimensional maze that would be much harder for her pursuers to search systematically, but it also meant she could become lost and trapped more easily. From her new vantage point, Sarah could see through grimy windows that the entire warehouse district was now swarming with activity. Black vehicles had formed a perimeter around a 6-block area, and she spotted snipers taking positions on rooftops. Whatever operation she had stumbled into was massive in scope and clearly had unlimited resources behind it. Her cell phone had no signal, which she realized was probably not accidental. The area was likely being jammed to prevent any communications that might compromise the mission. Sarah was completely cut off from the outside world, with no way to call for help or even let anyone know where she was. Moving carefully through the second building, Sarah began to piece together what she was seeing. The coordination and equipment suggested a joint task force involving multiple agencies. The secrecy and shoot-to-kill mentality meant this was probably related to national security or organized crime at the highest levels. She found a stairway leading to the roof and decided that getting to higher ground might give her a better view of possible escape routes. The climb was treacherous, with several steps missing and the handrail loose in places. But reaching the roof revealed both good news and bad news. The good news was that she could see a way out. Several blocks away, beyond the perimeter of black vehicles, normal city life was continuing. People were walking to work, traffic was flowing normally, and the world was going about its business unaware of the deadly drama playing out in the warehouse district. The bad news was that between her current position and safety lay what appeared to be an impenetrable network of surveillance and armed personnel. Every street was being watched, every building was being searched, and thermal imaging helicopters were now circling overhead like mechanical vultures. Sarah realized that simply running was no longer enough. To survive this ordeal, she would need to think like the professionals hunting her. She would need to anticipate their moves, exploit their assumptions, and find weaknesses in their seemingly perfect operation. Her life depended on outmaneuvering people who were trained to leave no loose ends. As she crouched on the rooftop, watching the methodical search pattern below, Sarah began to formulate a desperate plan. It would require perfect timing, incredible luck, and the kind of courage she wasn't sure she possessed. But it might be her only chance to escape the kill zone alive. Sarah's plan was born from desperation and her intimate knowledge of hospital emergency protocols. She had noticed that the search teams were following standard military procedure, which meant they had predictable patterns and blind spots. Her years of managing medical crises had taught her that even the most organized systems had weaknesses that could be exploited under the right circumstances. From her rooftop position, she observed that the teams rotated their positions every 20 minutes, probably to prevent fatigue and maintain alertness. During these rotations, there were brief windows when certain areas had reduced coverage. More importantly, she noticed that the helicopters followed flight patterns that created momentary gaps in their thermal surveillance. Sarah's nursing experience had also taught her about shock and hypothermia. She realized that if she could lower her body temperature significantly, she might be able to reduce her thermal signature enough to avoid detection by the overhead cameras. The abandoned building was filled with old pipes and containers, some of which still contained stagnant water that had been sitting in darkness for years. The plan was risky to the point of being potentially suicidal, but it was better than waiting to be found. Sarah made her way back down into the building and located a large container filled with ice-cold water. She forced herself to submerge completely, allowing the frigid temperature to shock her system and lower her core body temperature. Here, cold was immediately overwhelming, but Sarah gritted her teeth and stayed under until her body began to go numb. When she emerged, she was shivering uncontrollably, but her body temperature had dropped enough that she hoped to appear less distinct on thermal imaging. She had perhaps 10 minutes before hypothermia would make her too weak to function effectively. Moving, with careful timing, Sarah waited for the next helicopter to complete its sweep and begin turning toward a different section of the district. During this brief window, she sprinted across the rooftop toward the adjacent building using the cover of air conditioning units and ventilation systems to mask her movement from ground observers. The jump between buildings required every ounce of athletic ability she possessed. Sarah launched herself across the gap, landing hard on the neighboring rooftop and rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she was alive, and had successfully moved closer to the perimeter without being detected. From this new position, she could see that the operation below was beginning to wind down. Whatever the primary objective had been, it appeared to be nearing completion. Vehicles were being repositioned, and some personnel were pulling back to outer positions. Sarah realized that once the main operation concluded, the focus would shift entirely to finding and eliminating her. The building she now occupied had a fire escape that descended into an alley running parallel to one of the perimeter streets. If she could reach the alley without being spotted, she might be able to time her escape to coincide with normal pedestrian traffic on the main street. But getting to the fire escape required crossing an open section of rooftop that was visible from multiple surveillance positions. Sarah noticed that a delivery truck was making regular stops along the perimeter street, and the driver appeared to be unaware of the operation taking place just blocks away. If she could time her descent to coincide with the truck's next stop, she might be able to use it as cover to blend into normal street activity. The hypothermia was making her movement sluggish and her thinking cloudy, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the precise timing required. She watched the helicopter patterns, counted the seconds between radio check-ins from the ground teams, and calculated the delivery truck's schedule based on its previous stops. Everything had to align perfectly. The helicopter would need to be facing away from her position. The ground team would need to be in the middle of their rotation cycle, and the delivery truck would need to be positioned to block the sight lines from at least 2 sniper positions. The window of opportunity would last no more than 90 seconds. As the moment approached, Sarah crawled to the edge of the rooftop and prepared to descend the fire escape. Her hands were numb from cold, making it difficult to grip the metal rungs safely. One slip would mean falling 3 stories onto concrete, but hesitation would mean certain death when the search teams found her. The helicopter turned away. The delivery truck pulled up to make its next stop, and the ground team began their position rotation. Sarah swung her leg over the rooftop edge and began her desperate descent toward what she hoped would be freedom, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she would survive to tell the story of what she had witnessed in the kill zone. The fire escape descent was a nightmare of frozen metal and failing grip strength. Sarah's hypothermic condition made every movement a struggle as she fought to control her shivering while maintaining silence. Each step down the metal stairs seemed to echo like thunder in her ears, though she knew her perception was distorted by fear and cold. Halfway down, disaster nearly struck. Her numb fingers slipped on a rung slick with morning dew, and she barely caught herself before falling. The near miss sent a small piece of rust clattering to the alley below, and Sarah froze in terror as she waited to see if anyone had heard. Seconds stretched like hours before she convinced herself it was safe to continue. When she finally reached the alley, Sarah discovered her plan had a fatal flaw. The delivery truck that was supposed to provide cover had moved on ahead of schedule, leaving her exposed in the narrow space between buildings. Worse, she could hear voices approaching from both ends of the alley as search teams systematically checked every possible hiding spot. Desperation drove creativity. Sarah spotted a maintenance dumpster filled with old cardboard and industrial waste. Without hesitation, she climbed inside and buried herself under the debris, trying to create an air pocket while remaining completely hidden. The smell was overwhelming, but it was better than the alternative. The search team entered the alley within minutes, and Sarah could hear them checking behind every obstacle and container. When they reached her dumpster, she held her breath as someone lifted the lid and shined a flashlight over the contents. The beam passed directly over her position, but the cardboard and trash provided just enough camouflage to mask her outline. After what felt like an eternity, the searchers moved on, but Sarah knew her hiding spot was only temporary. The dumpster would be thoroughly searched again during the next sweep, and her body heat was already starting to return as she recovered from the hypothermia. Soon the thermal imaging would be able to detect her presence even through the debris. Waiting for the voices to fade, Sarah carefully extracted herself from the dumpster and assessed her situation. The alley connected to a loading dock area that served several businesses on the perimeter street. If she could reach one of those businesses and blend in with normal activity, she might be able to escape the search zone entirely. The loading dock belonged to a restaurant that was just beginning its morning prep work. Sarah could see kitchen staff arriving for work, carrying supplies and equipment through the service entrance. Their casual behavior suggested they were unaware of the massive operation taking place just blocks away. Timing her movement carefully, Sarah slipped out of the alley and approached the loading dock as if she belonged there. Her appearance was disheveled from hours of hiding and climbing, but in the early morning light she hoped to pass for a delivery person or maintenance worker. A young man carrying cases of vegetables looked at her curiously, but didn't seem alarmed. Sarah realized that looking confident was more important than looking clean, so she straightened her shoulders and walked purposefully toward the restaurant's rear entrance as if she had every right to be there. Inside the restaurant's back area, Sarah found herself in a world of normal human activity that felt surreal after her hours in the kill zone. Cooks were preparing for the lunch rush, servers were setting up tables, and managers were reviewing schedules. No one paid attention to another person moving through their workspace during the busy morning setup. Sarah spotted a staff bathroom and quickly ducked inside to clean herself up and assess her injuries. The mirror revealed scratches on her face and arms from crawling through tight spaces, and her clothes were torn and stained. But she was alive, and for the first time in hours she was surrounded by ordinary people going about their daily lives. The restaurant had a front entrance that opened directly onto a busy city street filled with morning commuters. If Sarah could walk out that door and disappear into the crowd, she would finally be free of the kill zone. But she also knew that her escape would only be temporary unless she could find a way to ensure her safety permanently. As she prepared to leave the bathroom and make her final bid for freedom, Sarah realized that surviving the kill zone was only the beginning of her problems. She had witnessed something that powerful people were willing to kill to keep secret, and simply escaping the immediate danger would not guarantee her long-term survival. She would need to be smarter, more careful, and more strategic than she had ever been in her life. The handle of the bathroom door felt like the gateway between two worlds, the nightmare she was leaving behind and an uncertain future where she would have to stay one step ahead of people who had unlimited resources and no compunction about eliminating problems. Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping toward what she hoped would be the beginning of her journey to true safety. Walking through the restaurant's dining room felt like entering another dimension. Normal people sat at tables drinking coffee and checking their phones, completely unaware that a massive covert operation was taking place just blocks away. Sarah forced herself to move casually, nodding at the hostess as she headed toward the front door like any other customer leaving after breakfast. The street outside was busy with morning traffic and pedestrians hurrying to work. Sarah merged into the crowd and began walking away from the warehouse district, resisting every instinct that told her to run. Running would draw attention, and attention was the last thing she needed when her life depended on invisibility. 3 blocks from the restaurant, Sarah ducked into a coffee shop and used their phone to call her sister Lisa, who lived across town. She couldn't risk using her own cell phone, which might be trackable, and she needed someone she could trust completely. When Lisa answered, Sarah's carefully controlled composure finally cracked. The conversation was brief and cryptic. Sarah told her sister that she was in serious trouble and needed help immediately, but she couldn't explain over the phone. Lisa, who had always been protective of her younger sister, agreed to meet at a public location they both knew well, the Central Library downtown. During the 20-minute bus ride to the library, Sarah's mind raced through everything she had witnessed. The professional equipment, the military-style coordination, and the shoot-to-kill mentality all pointed to a government operation at the highest levels. But what had they been doing in that warehouse district, and why was secrecy so critical that innocent witnesses had to be eliminated? At the library, Sarah found Lisa waiting in the reference section, looking worried and confused. In whispered conversations between the book stacks, Sarah told her sister everything that had happened since her morning jog. Lisa's expression grew more horrified with each detail, but she never questioned the truth of what Sarah was telling her. Lisa's response was immediate and practical. As a paralegal, she understood the legal implications of what Sarah had witnessed, and she knew that going to local police would be useless if federal agencies were involved. She suggested they contact an investigative journalist she knew who specialized in government accountability stories. The journalist, Maria Santos, agreed to meet them that evening at a small cafe outside the city. Maria had built her career, exposing corruption and cover-ups, and she understood the dangers involved in challenging powerful institutions. After listening to Sarah's story, she made a decision that would change all their lives. Maria had sources within various government agencies who had previously provided information about questionable operations. She began making careful inquiries, using encrypted communications and coded language to avoid triggering surveillance systems. What she discovered confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the scope and danger of what she had stumbled into. The operation Sarah had witnessed was part of a joint task force investigating international arms trafficking with connections to terrorist organizations. The warehouse district had been used as a meeting point for a major transaction, and the operation to intercept it had been planned for months. Sarah's presence had potentially compromised the entire investigation and put undercover agents at risk. But Maria also discovered something that offered hope. The operation had been successful despite Sarah's interference, and the primary targets had been captured. This meant that the immediate pressure to eliminate witnesses had decreased, though the long-term threat to Sarah's safety remained significant. Working together, Maria, Lisa, and Sarah developed a strategy for ensuring Sarah's survival. Maria would publish a carefully crafted story about government overreach and civilian endangerment, without revealing specific operational details. This would create a public record of the events and make it politically difficult for anyone to take action against Sarah without creating a larger scandal. The story ran in several major newspapers within a week, describing how an innocent jogger had nearly been killed during a federal operation that showed reckless disregard for civilian safety. The articles called for better protocols to protect bystanders and greater oversight of joint task force operations. The strategy worked. Within days of the story's publication, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. A woman identifying herself as a federal prosecutor explained that Sarah's cooperation in not revealing sensitive operational details was appreciated, and that steps were being taken to ensure her safety going forward. Sarah never learned the full details of what she had witnessed that morning in the warehouse district, but she did learn that sometimes survival depends not just on escaping immediate danger, but on managing the aftermath with intelligence and courage. The kill zone had failed to claim her life, but it had forever changed her understanding of how the world really worked. Months later, Sarah still takes her morning jogs, but she chooses routes through busy neighborhoods filled with witnesses and security cameras. She learned that the safest place to be is not always the most isolated, and that sometimes the best protection comes from ensuring that your story becomes too public to suppress. The woman who walked through the kill zone, alive, had become someone much stronger and wiser than the nurse who had simply wanted a quiet place to exercise.